conference audience, dear contributors, herzlich willkommen, or for some of you, welcome back to our second day of the conference, Man, Male, Masculine. When we started planning this conference, not everyone was convinced that putting men in the spotlight and giving them even more attention that they are already giving to themselves was such a good idea. But yesterday's headlines confirmed that we need to speak with men and about men and our understanding of masculinity. The Chinese government banned certain TV shows for preventing sissy men to gain influence over the young audience and allow a more masculine version of men to stay the norm. At the same time, a German right-wing politician called Höcke used the election period to point out again that we need to rediscover our manhood. Only then, so his logic, can we stand strong and are able to defend ourselves. While Höcke clearly tries to connect masculinity to a patriotic duty, which has been done for ages, the Chinese government seems to be afraid of too much diversity amongst men. Have we lost our manliness somewhere along the way, like the rediscovering implies? And more important, is this the long lost formula for a happy ending? Is all we need to do find masculinity in order for all of us to live happily ever after? But even if I want to start searching for masculinity, how do I know what I'm looking for? How do I actually recognize masculinity when I see it? The underlying implication here that there's a single masculinity which is right and which needs to be followed by everyone read as male is as much a lie today as it has ever been. Professor Meuser, one of our keynote speakers yesterday, gave a short summary of the development of different concepts of masculinity over the last years, which I would like to share with you. While Michael Meuser concludes that we find ourselves in a mixed situation, old patterns still exist while they are being questioned and challenged openly, and alternative concepts such as inclusive masculinities are already part of our lives. At some point, the German feminist Alice Schwarzer pointed out that while men have, sometimes grudgingly and sometimes not, started to share their space in the business world with women, they are unwilling to share the household duties. So the success of the feminist struggle meant double workload for the women, since the transition is not over yet. I thought of this when I saw a young man in a YouTube video speak about how hard it is to be a man in India today. While according to him, women do want a man who considers them a partner encouraged them to pursue a career of their own, and shares the care work for the family. Their aspirations when it comes to annual income of someone who is husband material have not changed at all. Having to be the traditional breadwinner while including lots of new ideas in his understanding of masculinity left him feeling overwhelmed and over-challenged. It seems the prominent concept of the breadwinner has not disappeared from our thoughts, a point that Romit Chaudhary made yesterday when speaking about masculine solidarity amongst rickshaw drivers in Calcutta. The specific solidarity amongst men is based on their understanding that they are out there in the street to support their family. A morally valued cause, but one that excludes women as earners and women as part of public life. Comedian Shreyas Manohar shared his plan with us to cry his way up to becoming Prime Minister of India after having discovered how influential male tears can be simply due to their bareness. Male vulnerability and the lack of spaces and relationships that allow for it was also a topic in our wonderful spoken word performances. We had Dr. Khan pointing out that COVID affects more men than women, and Meena Kandaswamy spoke about the right to wear a mustache that is often denied to low-caste men. So performing a hegemonic masculinity is a path only very few can take. Dr. Berthold Franke used the example of the German sociologist Max Weber to remind us of the high price some men have to pay for performing this hegemonic masculinity that doesn't suit their character at all. Sumati Ramaswamy made the point that what is a manly concept is shaped by historical circumstances. During colonial rule, a seemingly defeat or weakness was turned into an iconic image of masculine strength, and pictures of imprisoned men became icons of masculinity. Going even further back in time, Madhavi Menon reminded us of the very gender fluid stories surrounding the god Ayyappan, which have been mainstreamed by current political forces. And not only yesterday's headlines showed us the urgency of the topic. One panelist participating from a hospital and the other from a train shows how much people are invested in this. We certainly didn't find the answers yesterday, but lots of food for thought and great allies for the long way ahead of us. But before I now wish you a great day too, with more inspiring ideas, I want to close with a question from Ananya Hajra that has been circling in my head since yesterday. Can we do masculinity without men? Please enjoy the conference. And with this, I hand over to my colleague, Madanalini Narai.
Thank you, Frau Georgen. Good afternoon to one and all, and welcome to this very special presentation on performing masculinity. Is gender an ongoing performance that we all engage with continually? Is movement central to this performance of gender? Can dance loosen the nuts and bolts of gender and allow it to become playfully unstable? Can dance become a way for us to challenge singular perspectives on gender and sexuality? Or can dance become a political device that allows us to destabilize existing notions of gender? Answers to all these and several more questions are to be revealed by a dance practitioner, exploring the intersections between dance creation, performance, research, and pedagogy. Yes, it is none other than contemporary dancer Mandeep Raikhy, director of Gati Dance Forum, one who has not only toured widely with his dance works, but has also developed a supportive environment for contemporary dance in India. To know more about Mandeep or his works, you can follow the links posted on our webpage, our social media handles, as well as the chat box here. If you have any questions or comments, kindly send them via the Q&A box and Mandeep will be glad to address them at the end of his presentation, which we are all very much looking forward to. Over to you, Mandeep.
Thank you, Mrinalini, for the introduction and for the invitation to present here. So I wanted to actually start with talking about the relationship between gender, sexuality, and dance that I have been preoccupied with over the last several years as part of my practice. And for me, the three constructs of gender, sexuality, and dance have been an interesting thing to think about altogether, also because they all performed through the body. Body becomes the central sort of vehicle where gender, sexuality, and dance get inhabited. So for me, what's been interesting is to ask this question of what kind of a dialogue do they have with each other in the body. As a choreographer, what is it in the language of dance then that lends itself to a fruitful dialogue about gender and sexuality? Can we study gender through dance? Is it possible to perform sexuality through dance? And to what means? I want to talk through this presentation about two works that I have created over the last several years. A Male Ant Has Straight Antennae and Queen Size. Both of these works have explored ways in which gender and sexuality can be performed through dance. So I want to talk about both of these works in isolation from each other, but also in the ways that they actually connect with each other as well. So A Male Ant Has Straight Antennae was created in 2013. And the trigger for this work was a realization that I had that all through my childhood, I spent a lot of time resisting notions of masculinity that were being proposed to me by several people, including parents, teachers, as well as all kinds of media. And I remember spending a lot of time disagreeing with many of these instructions that were being proposed to me. And soon enough, I realized actually that dance wasn't very different from gender from one perspective, that they both had training systems that very, very complex training systems that supported them. While in dance, it was easy to identify the training system because you voluntarily went to a teacher and learned dance, and you knew what those instructions were doing to your body. With gender, gender training system is a little bit more sneaky, I think. Before you know it, all kinds of sources are telling you how to stand, to speak, what to say, what to like, what to dislike, and a whole lot of instructions around how to be. And while I was beginning to make this work, I realized that my dance teacher and my mother at different points in my life had told me exactly the same thing, which was, can you let your shoulders down and can you broaden your shoulders? And they were both coming from very different perspectives, but the instruction was exactly the same. So when I began to think about A Male Ant Has Straight Antennae, I thought of one very, very simple question. How does one study masculinity through dance? So in a way, what the work became was a kind of construction site. If you think of a construction site where gender is played out, masculinity is demolished. It is demolished precisely so that new iterations can be put forth as propositions. And the first set of questions that we asked ourselves when we entered the studio space, we were about 7 dancers who entered the studio space, was how do we perform masculinity through our bodies? Where does it sit inside our body? How have all of those instructions that we have received over the years How do they sit in our bodies? And is it possible for us to recall those instructions and look at how the body can respond to them quite deliberately and quite performatively? So we began to look at what are the ways in which, let's say, a shoulder begins to perform masculinity. What are the ways in which the hips can begin to drop away masculinity? We began to look at also the act of walking, the very simple act of walking that we all do. Is it, to begin with, is it possible for us to at all come up with and experience the notion of a neutral walk, a walk that is devoid of gender? So we began to look at the function of the walk. You know, what are the various body parts doing to be able to fulfill the function of a walk? And then from that position of functionality, we began to look at the various singular shifts that happen in different body parts that propose notions of gender. So for example, we began to look at what happens when your pelvis begins to slide forwards when you're walking. Is there a notion of gender that begins to get formulated if your ribcage begins to lead the walk? What happens if your shoulders cave in when you were walking? So in sort of isolating and beginning to make slight deviations from a functional / neutral walk, we began to see how anatomically gender began to get formulated. We also, through the making of the work, began to look at various kinds of stereotypes. We looked at stereotypes that could begin to come alive through performance and also begin to get demolished through repetition. How do we then look at stereotypes like, for example, the arms, very built up arms from the gym? You know, it's a kind of image that we associate a quote unquote, a strong man with. You know, the bulging biceps in a gym. How do we then treat that stereotype choreographically? How do we begin to treat it in time and through repetition so that this, the image of the arms begins to become a creature of its own? Through the work, I also began to think about how the training system that we had identified as the one that molded our bodies into various kinds of embodiments of gender, how do these structures, how does the training system as a structure also begin to become visible in a performative work? How do you also begin to highlight not just the impact that that the training system has had on your body, but also the system itself? Is it possible to also make the structure come alive as a performance? And relatedly, could other kinds of structures that do not directly have an impact on the anatomy of the body, but most certainly do allow masculinity to play itself out? For example, sports, games, work environments, institutions such as marriage, where power dynamics are expected to play out, where one-upmanship, domination, and the ideas like competition become highlighted and begin to sort of play themselves out. How does one also set these structures up performatively? There was much conversation in the studio about the quantification of masculinity. How does one quantify it? Is it possible to measure it? Is it possible? How do we measure it? Do we measure it through the measuring of our body parts? Do we measure it through the strength of our body parts? How do we actually measure masculinity, if at all we can? So that's another question we sort of posed to ourselves in the studio. So could proximity, for example, become a measure of masculinity? Is it possible then to measure our comfort and discomfort to look at comfort and discomfort with other bodies as a measure of masculinity. For example, if I bring my body very close to another male body, do I begin to look at that proximity as a threat to my masculinity? So quickly enough, I realized that here, while I was beginning to think about masculinity through proximity and touch, we were entering the zone of sexuality already. The ways in which touch sort of becomes a playground for masculinity, where on the surface of the skin, we play our own masculinities out. Does a soft contact with another man, does that threaten our masculinity? Or does a particular kind of contact begin to strengthen our notion of our own masculinity? So in a sense, what touch sort of opened up for me is what continued into the next work, into Queen Size, and which I'll talk about a little bit more, about how this notion of touch and kind of social relatability between bodies, relationality between bodies, soon for me began to be enter the realm of sexuality, and Queen Size deals with that a little bit more. I just wanted to move to a short clip of a Mayland has straight Antony, so that we have a sense of what happened on stage eventually, and what was the kind of culmination of some of this work that we had done in the studio. It's a 3-minute video, and we can come back and talk about Queen Size afterwards. So while Emile and her straight Antony looked at gender as a construction, queen size began for me as a response to Section 377 that criminalized homosexuality in India all the way up till 2018. And I began to sort of think of how up until then activists, lawyers, writers, citizens had registered their dissent against this law in several ways. And I began to think about what is it that dance has to say about it. Is there anything that dance has something particular to say about intimacy and desire that is policed by a law? I soon, as soon as I began to sort of think about the project, I realized that intimacies, desires, tenderness that gets experienced behind closed doors can possibly have very, very strong political potency if they're performed publicly as protest. So I began to think about whether dance can make an embodied argument against a law that's been set up to control and police the desire of the body. Who better than the body itself that can make an argument for its own desire? So with these thoughts in mind, I began to think about ways in which intimacy could be constructed performatively. Quite early on in the process, we realized that that there wasn't going to be real intimacy in this performance. The two performers, Lalit Khatana and Parinay Mehra, came from different sexualities, were not attracted to each other by a mile. So then how does one then think about breaking down intimacy and constructing it, breaking it down into its elements? What are the elements of intimacy then? We began to look at elements like proximity, eye contact, touch, various sexual positions, and began to think about how to construct a vocabulary for this work of performed intimacy through a mix of several of these elements. Another one of the concerns that I had during the making of the work is that very often a performance work has a wall of fiction where the audience members think of the performance as something that's fictionalized, something that gets over at the time where performance is, the curtain call happens. And it's very, very easy for one to distance oneself away from the content of the work as soon as it is over. And for me, that's one of the problematic things about performance, is that that it lives behind this safe wall of fiction. And for this particular work, I began to think about how one may be able to disrupt that wall of fiction. How does one break down the linear flow of performance, which usually gives rise to a narrative, right? You watch something from point A to point B and you construct a narrative for yourself. And also during feedback for one of the works in progress, I heard from one of the audience members saying, oh, so these two people actually kind of break up at the end, right? So I got thoroughly alarmed, thinking that, you know, one has to address this kind of linear formation of narrative. So we began to think of the work as 7 different fragments, which were very, very different dimensions of intimacy, let's say each fragment was, and look at ways in which these 7 fragments could be performed repeatedly through the evening over 2.5 hours. And after each fragment, the doors of the performance space would open. People could leave or enter the performance space so that any meaning that could be settled by through linearity could be washed away by this flow of people going in and out of the room. So that's one of the concerns that we had. So relatedly, one of the questions that came up was also that of choice. If what the work is really proposing is that two consenting adults, if they make a choice to be intimate with each other, they should have the space to be intimate with each other. Then is it possible for everyone in the room to have that choice? Is it possible then for the audience members to not be sitting captive in a performance? Just because they're there to watch a performance, they have to watch it. Is it possible for us to share that choice also with the audience members? So in the way that the work was structured, the audience members could walk in and walk out of the performance space at the end of each fragment. They could make choices about where to watch it from. Did they want to be up close and personal with the bed, very close to the bed, or did they want to stand away and watch it from a distance? Did they want to go out and have a little moment before they came back in? Did they want to leave immediately? And so everyone needed to be able to exercise that choice. I also began to think about how choice could be made available to the performers, because very often the choreographer becomes a kind of hegemonic figure, right, in this transaction between a performer and a choreographer. Is it possible for the work then to be performed in a way where the performers make choices about how the work is structured? So the 7 fragments, when they were repeated several times, the performers made choices about what order to follow it in. They had to negotiate before each fragment among themselves in front of the audience about what is it that they are both willing to perform next, and so on and so forth. Another spatial concern that I had, and it continues to be a nagging concern for me, is that very often in performance, there is a distance between the performer and the audience, where you know who is performing and you know who's watching. And I wanted to disrupt that a little bit, because very often what that leads to, and especially in conversation around queer rights, is that there's an othering that happens. Oh, look at them, they're asking for their rights. And I wanted to see if performatively one could resolve that question of that distancing and othering. So we began to look at ways in which this wall between the audience and the performers could be disrupted. So very often in the work, the audience members made choices about touching the bed because it was so close. Very often the sweat of the performers fell on the faces of the audience members. You could smell the sweat in the room after a certain point. And also the performers would sit where the audience members were sitting very often. So that, the idea was really, through this sort of breaking down of a wall between the performer and the audience members, is it possible for us to make this question of queer rights about all our rights? So it's not about some of rights of some of us, but the fact that that our desire is being policed by the state through laws such as the Section 377. Doesn't that concern all of us? Isn't it a question that we are all concerned about? Because we all have intimacies that we want to think about, that we want to practice. So that's the other question. The last one was, I was often faced with this question that if I'm looking at material which is so sexual in nature, very often I questioned myself, saying, if pornography is what I'm making, live pornography, then why would people want to come and watch it? Then I can also send them a video. It all exists on the internet. What is it that dance can do to these sets of actions that these set of actions can't do themselves? So I began to think about what is it that the choreographic can do to an image that we are so familiar with, by slowing it down, by organizing it in space, by thinking about rhythmically structuring it. Can one make the familiar unfamiliar again? Can we then propose the audience members to bring in a fresh gaze to this material? So that's the other thing that I was concerned about. And just wrapping up, because I know we're going to run out of time soon. I began to think of how intimacy could become a political device. And for me, this is something that has continued beyond this work as I begin to think about new work, as I continue to make new work. I continue to think about how intimacy could possibly be a political device, one that allows us to ask questions in relation to the body, one that centers empathy as a mode of exchange, rather than spending time, effort, and really actually sometimes to a point of exhaustion of arguing, asserting, shouting for our rights. What happens when we put very intimate parts of ourselves out there in front of others? Does that invoke empathy in ways that an argument can't? Does intimacy, when constructed deliberately, become a more compelling way for us to ask for our rights? Can danced intimacy become a potent political device through which we can negotiate power in the world? And finally, do constraints of gender and sexuality, when danced, create a space where embodied empathy becomes central to our way of being with each other in the world? So I want to end the presentation there and field some questions. There are some already, which is great, fabulous. So Sushen Biswas says, it looks like I don't have gender training. Probably no one has in my area. Is that an effect of a natural way of living? I'm wondering whether there can be a way of living in this world without the gender training that we do receive. We had a conversation earlier today among the workshop participants in the workshop that I took earlier about some people not having gone through very directly conversations around masculinity, but equally they had lots of information to deal with as far as their femininity was concerned. So in a way that they, lots of people spoke about how they were told not to speak very loudly, and that's why it's one of the things that many women shared this morning was that they were asked to not speak very loudly. So yeah, I'm wondering whether we are trained as humans to conform to certain standards and make sure that those standards remain untouched. And I'm wondering whether one could flip it, and in the way that we live our lives, disrupting standards could become a way of being. And yes, we didn't show a clip of Queen Size, so I'm just going to go back and show a clip of Queen Size, and then we can continue with these questions. Thanks. Thank you. I want to take the next question, which says, did queen size shows have a backlash from toxic masculinity? So this is actually a concern that we had when we made the work and we premiered it. I remember being overly concerned about stationing friends in particular places so that they know what to do if somebody starts speaking up or has a problem. And then we realized actually that we just needed to trust the structure of the work. Because people had a choice about leaving the space, we realized that very few people, there were a few people who began to sort of grumble and then began to look for the door in the middle of the fragment. But then we realized that actually whoever had a problem left quite immediately. And of course, their leaving also then became part of the performance because, you know, everyone's sort of, the way the work is positioned, everyone's gaze and presence is part of the work because it's such a sort of an environment which is quite tightly knit, so you're able to see each other while you're watching the work. So if somebody leaves the work or somebody's looking uncomfortable and doesn't want to engage with the work, their eyes are down, all of that becomes visible in the work. So in a sense, you also realize that the structure of the work made the gaze quite accountable. You knew you were also being watched. You know, it wasn't a kind of situation where you could, you know, you're sitting in the dark and you can't be seen. You could be on your phone or asleep for all that matters. But here the gaze became accountable. And so that the structure of the work in that sense gave enough space for people to leave if they needed to, or come back, or watch it 3 times, and so on and so forth. Mayuki's question is, do you believe gender is a stable locus of identity? Does it become a constant, relatively stable, or is it always in a state of flux? So I think for me personally, I think it's a little bit of both. Much like dance, where there is a stream of dance that institutions want to keep constant. Perhaps the classical dance is one such example, where there are institutions that are created to keep it constant and to keep it stable. There are also equally spaces where dance has the space to experiment and to ask questions of itself. And I think same holds true also for gender. I know that both of these forces are at play simultaneously. So in a sense that, yeah, I think that there's a bit of both, and it's in the negotiation that that actually gender or dance for that matter transforms over time, when both of these tensions begin to negotiate with each other. Oh, there are many, so I may have to, because I think we have space for only 1 or 2 more. Mitali asks, gender, we generally use this word often with men and women. Gender is something socially built up by the society. So do you think if gender word wasn't there, then it would have been a very different experience? Thinking from a women's perspective. It's hard to imagine it not having a name, but yeah, I think it's for me, I am charmed by the idea of disrupting identities. If there's a way for us to begin to unname things, do we then make space for newer experiences that don't have to conform to binaries? So yeah, I think for me, this is a speculative question. So I would say that yes, in a scenario where there isn't a word for gender, I'm very, very sure we would be embodying very differently. We would be embodied as citizens, as people very, very differently than what we are now, because we have a kind of binary in gender that is quite deeply sort of set in society. So last question, ArtX company asks. Such a beautiful presentation, Mandeep. I feel like I understood two pieces even more with the insights that you shared. With such a close relationship that develops between choreographer and dancer, I'm curious how you approach the selection of dancers. What do you look for when auditioning dancers? And has there been an instance of a dancer working with you from a completely different background where it has either worked or not? Yeah, so interesting question, because both these works had a very, very different kind of auditioning space or a selection process. For Mayland, I think the work rested so much on a kind of plurality of the kinds of bodies we brought into the work, that the way for us to select dancers was really to look at various kinds of bodies, various kinds of experiences that would come into the studio that would complicate our understanding of gender and masculinity in particular. So that was certainly one kind of concern. So that's why I think in the work, it was also really, really important for Manju, who's a female dancer, to be in the work, because it was quite clear that you can't think about masculinity only from male body's perspective. So Manju's role became a central role because she became an observer. She became someone who embodied masculinity many of the times. Sometimes she disrupted it. Sometimes she became an instigator. Very often our mothers become instigators of masculinity, and they become gatekeepers of masculinity. But for Queen Size, for example, the selection process was very different, because I knew that it was a work that needed a certain kind of comfort of working with each other. So for me, it was quite, I invited 4 dancers that I had worked very closely with over the years. And I invited them into a workshop. So we tested out various ideas, and we sort of looked at various combinations of dancers working together. And the 2 of these sort of really stood out as I don't know, maybe there was chemistry. I don't know how to define it, but there was a certain kind of playfulness with which they came in with intimacy that became quite compelling already in the workshop process, and they became the players of the work. So yeah, for me, intimacy was also something that I looked for in the relationship that I had with dancers, because it was going to be a difficult process, I realized. I think we should end there with 3 minutes over time. Thank you very much for listening in. I'll pass it on to Mrinalini again.
I think this conversation needs to go on, but I would say that we are not stopping, but let us take a pause now. And you can all always keep in touch with Mandeep. His details you can again check out on the website links that we have on the chat box. And really, Dankeschön, lieber Mandeep, for sharing your ideas and views through some of your exclusive works, sometimes intimate, transparent, irresistibly riveting, full of complexity and nuance, embodiments of a vision for the future. And with that, we thank you all once again for being a part of this wonderful presentation. And we look forward to seeing you all at the talk session on gaming and masculinity by Anokhi Shah, which I think would have already started. Kindly check for the link in the chat column, and do enjoy this Saturday evening by joining in some of the other wonderful events that we have lined up. Dankeschön and auf Wiedersehen.